on Shabbos, but it is associated with a lot of insight and appreciation of nature. So that's one of the things we have focused on in the last class. And we're going to pick up about, I guess, with the second third of the parak. And my goal, I think, is probably not to get through the rest of it today. There is just too much to talk about, too much to look at. So we're going to instead aim realistically. We're going to try to study the middle third of the parak today, and hopefully we'll get through that and continue to get an appreciation for this really beautiful, beautiful chapter of Tehillim. Let me share my screen with you so we can all get back on the same page here. Okay.
Rifki, I have a fast question. I missed last week. Is there somewhere I could pick up the tape for it?
I think it is posted online.
Okay.
I'll answer you on. Hi. On YouTube, on the email. Do you get the emails from the show that remind you about the Tehillim class?
I guess it is on YouTube.
So at the bottom,
I would just Google your name and mention the number of Tehillim, and it would come up probably, right?
There is a YouTube, Rifki, that you have everything that is recorded.
Thank you so much.
I think you're better off going through the email. It's a little hard to find if you just Google it, but if you go through the shul email, it'll take you to the right place to look for it.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Perfect. Okay, so last time I think we had finished talking about the animals, and in particular, we were talking about water. And what we had mentioned in the earlier psukim was the notion that when Hashem differentiated water from land, he didn't separate them completely, which we said could perhaps be a metaphor for other very significant things in life, that sometimes we require boundaries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a total separation, right? Very often the right thing is not to completely cut something off or totally separate, but is to create a boundary. And then where it's necessary, where it's appropriate, and really where it's healthy would be to then bring that thing back into the terrain, so to speak. So I guess we would call the nimshal, right? The practical way that we see this in the world today is how Hashem really created boundaries, a significant border between the land and the ocean. In order for the dry land to exist, he had to pull the water off the land. And yet we're very aware that had he created a complete separation between land and water, all of the living beings on the land couldn't sustain themselves, right? We need water, so that even though there is this delineation, this not total separation, we'll call it the border that was created between land and water. What Hashem did in his infinite wisdom was create these ways that the water was still going to be able to give life on earth. So it's not a total separation. And we had seen in the earlier psukim how he does that with, different creeks and rivers and brooks and all sorts of other natural bodies of water that let us know this beautiful idea of creating boundaries where appropriate, but not total separation. So that was one of the things that we looked at last time. And we see here, I think we'll pick up with Pasuk Yud Bet. I think that's where we left off, that Alehem here is referring to those bodies of water, those ma'ayanot, those well springs, or those reservoirs of water, Of Hashamayim Nishkon, that the birds of the sky, they tend to nest or rest, create their sanctuaries where there is water, of course, right? So that's where they choose to live. Mi bein afaim yitnu kol. And then they tend to sing out, right? They yitnu kol, they give their voice, mi bein afaim, from amongst the shrubbery, from amongst the foliage, right? Because the imagery that this is creating is that there's a natural body of water. And then because there's water there are some bushes or trees that have sprouted and can maintain themselves. And then because that greenery is there, that's where the birds feel safe to rest. So what we're starting to get is this imagery of different parts of nature feeding off each other and working together. And that's a theme we're going to continue to see throughout the parak. I had a funny experience on my walk to shul Shabbos morning. As you know, I have a very short walk, but on my walk to shul, there were birds chirping. Now, granted, it was not freezing freezing cold, but I was walking with my daughter, with Shayna, and the two of us were like, where is that coming from? And why are we hearing birds in Montreal in March? It was such an amazing thing to hear. It really gave me an appreciation for this idea of how you can have birds chirping or giving their voice, contributing their song from within, I didn't see any greenery anywhere. I only saw bare branches, but it was pretty amazing that we definitely heard birds. So just, to add a little imagery to the psukim, the beautiful words of David HaMelech. Mashkeh harim me'aliotav, right? He waters the mountaintops from even higher than that, right? So we have this image that there is water flowing through the valleys, but not necessarily like what water is taking care of the tops of the mountains. And we could even argue, like, does it really matter what goes on in the top of the mountain? Most of us will never see them. Most of us are not mountain climbers. And yes, we have National Geographic, and we now have the ability to use drones and all sorts of other technology to be able to see what the tops of those mountains look like. But for thousands of years, would it honestly have made a difference how Hashem was taking care of the tops of the mountains? Like, who would have seen it? And yet this is a reminder that Hashem runs the world in such a way that there are a lot of things going on that we can't see with our naked eye. We have no idea how exquisite and how beautiful certain parts of the world are. And we might think to ourselves, well, maybe it's not even so wonderful. Maybe he's not even taking care of that part. But David HaMelech reassures us, no, that's not the case. He is making sure that there is water up top. And of course, what that allows for is that the water then comes down the mountain and is not just providing the saturation that's required at the top of the mountain, but also allows for the water and the moisture and all of the nutrients to then come down the mountains and to give life to all of the other areas that people and animals are actually living on. Mipri ma'asecha tisbah haaretz. Right, the fruits of Hashem's creation. I believe one of the Mefarshim explains Mipri ma'asecha, it's the Ibn Ezra, refers to the trees, which is interesting because we could have explained this to mean so many different parts of nature, the fruit of Hashem's handiwork. And Ibn Ezra is very clear. No, here we are talking about trees. And in general, I would say there is a lot of focus on foliage, on trees. We're going to see a little bit more in the coming psukim in this parak of Tehillim. And we mentioned last week the idea that as much as we know Baltimot, that the land is never going to be thrown off its axis. The world will continue. It will not falter. But the responsibility for what happens on the earth is very much on us. And there is obviously no end to the science or the discussion about what we have unfortunately done to the environment. And one of the ways I think that is easiest for us to relate to this is when we understand what the trees actually give us. It's not just that, like in the book, The Giving Tree, right? It's not just that trees can give shade and trees can provide shelter. And we know that they allow for certain species of animals to live and to get their nourishment and their security and their safety in those trees. And same with the animals. But we're aware more now of what trees contribute to the overall environment, right? What they add to the air is so significant. And the challenge of trying to be productive people and maybe use a few disposable things that might not be so good for the environment, and maybe using too much paper and too many other things that take from the trees, and yet we know we need them. So the focus, that's sort of balancing the living our lives, but also always being mindful of the fact that we were left as the shomrim, we were left as the guardians, the gatekeepers for this world. And the trees seem to be the symbol that David HaMelech keeps going back to remind us of the beauty of nature and the way that Hashem set up the world and how it continues to contribute to the world functioning. Okay. Matzmiach chatzir labehema. So Hashem makes grass, almost like weeds, grow for the behema. For the behema is a domesticated animal. So matzmiach chatzir refers to the vegetation that really grows on its own. It doesn't require man's intervention to make it grow properly. Ve'esev la'avodat ha'adam. But there is esev for man. This takes us back, of course, to the psukim that describe creation, as we've been sort of going back and forth between the two. And that when the pasuk in Bereshit says, Tadshe ha'aretz desha, let the land produce deshe. Deshe, according to the commentaries, is the kind of greenery that the animals eat, right? That's not for human consumption, and it doesn't require human intervention. But ve'esev la'avodat ha'adam, the esev, like where the pasuk in Bereshit says, esev mazria zera, that reference to greenery or to grass, that does refer to the parts of planting that require human intervention, right? I know the shul actually has an exciting program coming up involved in planting and greenery. This is really not my area of talent or capability, beyond not. But the bottom line is this is an important aspect of man's contribution and man's controlling the world, man having dominion over the world, is our ability to have the world produce what we need to live. And so there is a distinction between the deshe and the esev, between the chatzir and the esev here, that which requires our intervention and that which does not. Lahotzi lecha min haaretz. And of course, what is the ultimate achievement of the things that grow from the ground? Well, that is to pull bread out of the earth. And of course, what you see here is a reference to lehotzi lecha min haaretz, right? And our bracha that we say on bread is hamotzi lecha min haaretz. So what I think is just so interesting about this is when we say the bracha hamotzi lecha min haaretz, we're referring to Hashem. Right? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hamotzi lecha min haaretz. Hashem, you are the source that allows bread to come from the earth. But this pasuk is really referencing the fact that man is the one, human beings are the ones that are involved in planting and tilling and all of the different aspects of agriculture that are necessary in order to eventually produce a loaf of bread that we might buy at the supermarket or we might make in our own homes. But even if we make the bread ourselves, right, we know that all of the ingredients that we buy from the store started off many, many, many steps earlier as stalks of wheat in the ground. And it's interesting to note sort of the dual nature of this phrase, that in this pasuk, it seems to be referring to man. But when we say the blessing, when we say the bracha on bread, we're referring to God. And this is really not the first example and definitely not the last where we will see in this parak the idea of a partnership. So this seems to me to be clear. It's a partnership between human beings and the earth, a partnership between human beings, Hashem, and the earth, right? We're sort of all in this together. What we're going to see continuing in an even, I think, more obvious way, not in the next two psukim, but after that in many, many psukim, we're going to see this constant reference to a symphony, so to speak, or a synergy, the way in which different parts of nature are continuously working together to produce what we get to experience today. Constant references to partnership and what it means to be a partner and to work with another human or another being. And that really seems to be part of the beauty of this parak of Tehillim. Okay. V'yayin yisamach levav enosh. This is a very interesting pasuk, especially to read around Purim time. V'yayin yisamach levav enosh. That wine brings joy to the heart of man. Lahatzil panim mishamen. And it brings sahala. Also a Purim reference, right? Sahala v'ha'ir Shushan, Sahala v'samecha. The capital city of Shushan was full of light. It was shining and it was joyous. So lahatzil panim mishamen. So far we have wine makes the heart of man happy. Oil makes the face of man shine, right? If a person would rub it on their face, they'd be glowing. V'lechem levav enosh yis'ad. We saw already what happens to the heart of man. What brings him joy is wine, but what brings him sustenance, what brings him seudah, right? Yisad, seudah, what brings him a sense of being full, that is bread. Okay, so we have these three different elements that are mentioned here: wine, oil, and bread. And there is a lot of ways to go through this. I'm going to give you two approaches. One of them is the idea that this whole pasuk is referring only to Torah, that each one of these things, both wine and bread and oil, can all be references to the Torah itself. And the way to read it would be that Torah brings joy to the heart of a person, meaning when a person studies it, and in what ways is the Torah like wine? So there's a beautiful medrash that talks about in what ways is the Torah like wine? Well, the Torah is like wine because, as you might have guessed, right, it gets better with age. Mityashen bekankan mishtabeach. The longer it stays, the longer it sits, the better it gets. And this could be a reference, to the longer a person thinks over an idea from the Torah, the more delicious it gets, the more beautiful it gets. Or it could be a reference to, as the Medrash says, to the Talmid Chacham themselves, right? Or to really any person who studies Torah, that the older a person gets, the more praiseworthy is their Torah, just like a good bottle of wine, right? The older it is, the more the flavor is, the more valuable it is. So that's one way that we can see that there is sort of a parallel between wine and Torah. Another way that we see it is, this was cute, that the Medrash is very aware of what wine does, what wine can do to a person. So it says, just like when there is wine inside a person, nikar baguf, it is recognized in the person. So too, when a person has Torah in their guf, when a person has Torah in the body, it's also recognizable, which I thought was a beautiful, a very subtle way of saying, fill yourself with more of one than the other. Also, perhaps a good thought going into Purim. And then finally, the idea, of course, that it brings joy, that the study of Torah brings us the greatest joy possible. So too, one could argue that wine could lighten or bring gladness to the heart of man. So too does the Torah. And we could go through the same thing when it comes to the oil and when it comes to bread, as far as it creating a sense of light and a sense of oil is also always used to refer to like wealth and a person being comfortable physically. So the Torah could provide that for a human being. Not necessarily in a financial sense, but in a sense of other types of comfort, as well as bread, of course, which, without bread, a human being really can't survive for very long. And so that is an easy parallel to the Torah. So that is one way to read it. Another way to read it is actually from, I'm trying to think where I saw it. The Mincha Shai. The Mincha Shai commentary says the following. And I looked in a couple of books that had, I'm going to look at another one while I'm talking to you. I looked in a couple of editions of Tehillim to see if I could find what he was talking about. I wasn't able to find it, but I'm going to take his word for it. What the Mincha Shai says is this word yisamach, which we pronounce yisamach, he says in some editions is actually listed as yisama or yishama, that the chet really is supposed to be a hey. And you could pronounce it yisamach, but it's meant to be written with a hey. So that's very interesting because, and this is really what makes his point, because what he says is simcha. I'm just looking. Yeah. And this edition also, I haven't yet found one where it's printed with a hey, but okay, we're going to take his word for it. That sin memchet, which means joy, is really the polar opposite, 180 degrees away from sin mem hey. Because sin or shin mem hey is related to the word shemama. Shemama means destruction. And so what the Mincha Shai points out is if a person is drinking wine, if he is zocha, and zocha here doesn't mean like he merits it or he's lucky. What I think the Mincha Shai means is if he exercises self-control, or she, right? If the individual exercises self-control and drinks at the appropriate times in the appropriate ways around Kiddush, Havdalah, a little bit of Adalo Yadan Purim, I guess, but meaning it happens in the context of a mitzvah. It happens in the context of Simchas Yom Tov or something like that. So then that person is Zocha, and that person will actually have true joy in their heart because they fulfilled a mitzvah and they've used something that Hashem put in this world and brought it to its highest form, right? Its highest level. They've elevated the wine, and the wine has therefore elevated them because of how they were drinking, as opposed to what could happen if a person doesn't exercise self-control. And then wine, as we know, unfortunately, can bring total destruction, right? I think we have all seen it happen in the here and now, but certainly we only have to look in the Torah itself to discover all of the horrific incidents that took place when a person drank too much and was, lost their ability to make proper decisions. And so that is sort of this really interesting way, I think, of understanding this concept of yayin yisamach levav enosh, right? It can really be a source of tremendous joy. It can be a beautiful way to celebrate, to make a l'chaim. The Medrash has a lot of interesting stories, many of which are not positive, but some of which are about things that happened when people got drunk and said a l'chaim and things got out of hand. And so it comes as I think, a cautionary tale that yayin can bring. It has the potential to bring simcha, but according to the Mincha Shai, it also has the potential to bring shimama. It also has the potential to bring destruction. Okay, this pasuk is brought very often as a source, I think, by the Rambam and others when they talk about what does it look like when the Torah tells us v'samachta b'chagecha, that we have an obligation to be happy on certain holidays, in particular the holiday of Sukkot, but it's really it's projected on all three of the Shalosh Regalim, of the Moadim, both Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuos. I shouldn't say both. All three of those have this obligation for simcha. It's mentioned specifically by Sukkot, but we apply it to all three. And the Rambam talks about what does that look like? What does that look like? And he says for each member of a family, that might look very different. And he brings this pasuk as an example, right? For some people, simcha is brought about by wine. For other people, it's brought about by oil. Fragrances or lotions or, taking self-care type of things. And for other people, it's bread. It's like a good, solid meal. So all different ways that a person could achieve simcha. I think this was something we spoke about in the Rosh Chodesh class, that even though we're told, Misha nichnas adar marbim b'simcha, the halacha doesn't really speak to what are we supposed to do in order to achieve that? And we suggested maybe that's because for each person that might look different. And so we sort of have to find those things that bring us that internal joy so that we can experience the joy of Adar. I would say like this Adar, it's very hard to feel simcha, but that feels kind of silly to say because every Adar we could have made that argument. And I think it's really all about the perspective. We have to just capture those moments of joy where we can find them. If any of you are on Facebook, I would tell you, take a look at the Hebrew Academy High School had a concert, Rosh Chodesh Adar, on Friday with Yo Eisenstark, a local musician here. And he posted it on his Facebook or his Instagram or something, videos of the kids. Literally, it was my simcha of Rosh Chodesh Adar. That's what I told him. Like, I wasn't there. I think I saw a 45-second clip and there was joy coming off of my computer screen. These kids were so excited to have the opportunity to dance, and with the world being a crazy place and a lot of difficulty always, both, locally and internationally, the whole world is in turmoil. And yet we always have to find a way to connect to simcha. So for me, it was definitely watching those amazing kids dancing and really just feeling the joy of Adar was so beautiful. Okay. Pasuk Ted Zayin. Here we go back to the trees, as I mentioned. Yisbe'u atzei Hashem. The trees of Hashem, interesting that they're called trees of Hashem. The trees of Hashem, they get their fill. Where do they get it from? This is probably a reference to a bit earlier where we were talking about the water that comes from on high and flows down throughout the different parts of nature. So the trees get their sustenance, they get their drink, they become full. And arzei levanon asher nata. This is specifically, David mentions the cedars of Lebanon, asher nata. And the way Sefaria is translating it is along the lines of the way some of the Mefarshim say, which is, if you want an example of a tree of God, one that you just know man had nothing to do with, like they are so big and so strong, and no human being could have possibly created or been responsible for the planting of these massive, massive trees. The same trees that were used in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle in the desert, as well as the trees that were used by Shlomo HaMelech in the building of the temple of the first Beit HaMikdash. So those are God's trees, both because they were used to build God's house and because one could argue, and this is really an approach, I would say, this is a lens through which to look at nature. There are certain things in nature. I mean, we could choose to look at all of nature like this, but then there are certain things in nature that you just look at them and you think to yourself, there's just no way a person could have made this happen. There's no way. Like, how could a human being possibly wrap their head around, a tree that is so much more powerful and has been around for so much longer than any person has ever, lived for? Like, there just had to be a master plan or master planner or master creator. It just had to be. And it's interesting that they refer to the trees of Hashem. And this very likely could be related to the fact, that one, he was responsible, Hashem was responsible for creating them, for planting them, so to speak. Or number two, that these trees specifically that we're referring to are those that were used in the house of Hashem, right? They were those that were used to create, to build the structures where people were designated to connect to Hashem. Asher sham tziporim yikanenu. And what happens in these very high trees? Like until the building of the Mishkan, let's say, and remember, this is David HaMelech writing. David, who wanted nothing more than to build the temple, to build the Beit HaMikdash. So for him, even though he knows the cedars of Lebanon, the Arzei Lebanon were used to build the Mishkan, he himself is really anxious and wanting more than anything to build the temple with these very same trees, but he's not going to be able to do it. It's going to be his son. So for him, if he's looking for an appreciation, well, what are these trees doing here? Like, what are these trees? What are they doing for me anyway? Right? Because I can't use them to do the one thing I want them to do. But he takes notice. Asher sham tziporim yikanenu. You know what happens in those mighty cedars of Lebanon? There are certain birds that make their nests there. There are certain birds that live so much higher up than the birds that come and hang out on our decks and, by our front lawns. Those birds that live so high up, they make use of those trees. Those trees were specifically put there in order that they would have a place to put their nests. A kan, as we know, the mitzvah of shiluach hakan, sending the mother bird away from the nest. A kan is a nest. So yikanenu is like the verb of nest. So they allows them to make their nests in that place. And whether that's because they're just more comfortable up there, they breathe better up there, or it's because they are safer there from predators, like whatever the reason, whatever the natural reason is that we've come up with that they need to be up there, Hashem made these trees. David HaMelech might be saying to himself, well, they're not really useful for me because I can't build the temple, but I see those birds are really taking advantage of the fact that they can build a nest in such a high, strong tree. There's no animal, no predator that's going to make its way up there. No way. Unless, of course, it's a hawk. That's a different story. Chasida beroshim beita, right? The stork has her home also in a very, very significant and unique type of tree. Nobody else would even have any idea. What do we need the roshim for? What do we need those kinds of trees, that type of foliage? Oh, I'll tell you, the stork needs it. The stork has its own unique needs. And this is another example, and we'll keep talking about this throughout the parak, where we see Hashem made every single thing for a reason. And most things he made for more than one reason. So the tree might provide the wood eventually for the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, but it also is, in the meantime, when it's not being used to build those things, is used to be the place where certain birds can build their nests. And so David is giving us an appreciation for how every single thing that we see in this world, in nature, was put there for, like I said, probably more than one reason, but it's serving a purpose. There is nothing in this world that doesn't serve a purpose. And we'll see that this theme continues. And I think it's meant to point us in the direction that not only does every creature, every creation have a purpose, but every human has a purpose. There's no such thing as an experience or an interaction that is not without its reason. Harim hagvohim laye'elim. Here's another example. The highest mountains are the perfect place for the wild goats, the Ya'el, right? That's the perfect place for them. The human beings can't do much with the highest mountains. Like, we can't plant there, right? If you've seen, either a National Geographic or some, if you've ever had an opportunity to Jeep or anything in those parts of Israel, like where it's just that light brown color. Nobody's planting up there. Most people can't even, cross that kind of terrain, but you see the ibexes and the wild goats and everything. You see like, oh yeah, that's the perfect place for them to hang out. That is the perfect terrain for them. Has no use for me, but it has a use for something else. So that's what those great mountains are for. Slaim machseh lashvaim and shvanim. And you might wonder, like, what do we need all those crags and the rocks for? Like all those little areas. Well, that's because there are these wild rabbits, shvanim. Okay, rock badgers. I don't know the difference. A shafan is the Hebrew word for a rabbit. But usually I guess there's an arnevet and a shafan, both of which we find in Tanakh. So we'll go with Safaria's translation that it's a rock badger, that those little crags in the rocks, they're also there for a reason. It's not an accident, right? The Yael can't get under there, but the smaller animals, they need a place of refuge. They need a place where they can hide, where they can perhaps hide from predators or from the sun. Like every single thing that Hashem put into nature has a reason. And it might not be for me. There might be things, as much as we say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for me. It was also created for other people and other creatures. And so it's very possible that when we see these psukim, this is meant to be a reminder for us, like, hey, just because I can't figure out how that helps me doesn't mean it's not important that it's there. It's helping somebody else or something else. Okay, now we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to keep the same theme of things working together and different parts of nature helping out each other and the requirement for partnership, but we're going to move from the earth up to the heavens. We're going to go celestial, from the terrestrial to the celestial. And this is it's a beautiful description. We keep saying we can picture David HaMelech looking up and then looking down or across. We're looking up and looking down, right? And looking across. And then in a little bit, we're going to see him look down, like into the water. So we can sort of visualize how he's looking all over the place. I actually saw that Rabbi Trump, I think in his shir, quoted from Amos Chacham. Amos Chacham is, actually shouldn't say is, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he was certainly one of the really most celebrated writers of the Jerusalem Bible, what's called in Hebrew, the Dat Mikra. And he wrote a very modern day commentary on, I think, all of Tanakh, if I'm not mistaken. There were many contributors to this project, but Amos Chacham was chief among them. He may have been the editor. And he writes in his, he always gives an introduction and a summary to every chapter of Tehillim. So he writes, if you'll notice, and I haven't been pointing this out, but maybe you noticed it without me pointing it out, that throughout this parak of Tehillim, we're already in the 20th pasuk here, there is a constant shift between past, present, and future, and a constant shift between first person, second person, and third person. It seems like David HaMelech, or the poet who's writing this, is all over the place. Like they're constantly being distracted and they're thinking back to something that they saw and they're looking forward to something that they think they will see. And they're distracted by what they're seeing right now. And I'm talking and you're talking. There is it's constantly in motion, constant movement. And that speaks to how overwhelmed, in a beautiful way, how overwhelmed David HaMelech was with nature. That with all that he was busy with, and as we talked about when we first started studying Tehillim together, David HaMelech had a very difficult life. But with all of that, with all of his challenges and with all of his suffering, he never lost sight of the beauty of Hashem's world. And it seems like, in fact, he used it was a source of comfort for him, and he used it as a way to connect to Hashem. And that's sort of the model that he set for us. And that's what we're trying to do as we study this parak. Okay, so let's go now up to the heavens. Tizrach hashemesh ye'asefun ve'el ma'onatam yirbatzun. Oh, okay. We're not quite up to the heavens yet. We're getting there. Oh, sorry. That's because I skipped. 1 second. I knew I got confused here. Sorry. I skipped too far ahead. We are up to Yotet. Okay. So we'll go back. Asayareach lamoadim. Hashem made the moon for the holidays, Moed, like Chol HaMoed, the Moadim. Shemesh Yadam Mevo'o. The sun knows what to do, right? Knows when it needs to come and when it needs to go. Okay, this is what I thought we were getting to. Got a little confused there. Asat Yareach LaMoadim. What does it mean that God made the moon for the holidays, or as it says here, for the seasons? So this is very simple. We know that the sun is fairly boring. Right? The sun is very powerful. The sun is very strong, but the sun doesn't change. Nothing about the sun changes. It is the most predictable aspect of nature, I think we could say, right? To the point that that's a phrase that we'll say, right? Like, just as sure as the sun will rise, or just as sure as the sun will set. That is something, Shemesh Yada Mevo'o. The sun knows its routine. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, so to speak. And the moon, though, is different. The moon, if we try to tell dates or seasons by the sun, we would have trouble. The moon, by definition, is there. It fluctuates. I don't want to say it's not predictable, because obviously there's a cycle, but it is forever changing. It is forever dynamic. It is never the same from one day to the next. It's always either waxing or waning, depending on what time of the month it is. And that notion that there is this balance in nature of something that is always, that is permanent, and something that is constantly changing, is a really interesting image that David HaMelech is creating for us. And then I think in general, Hashem gives us when he creates the world itself. And let's just go back to some of those ideas from Bereshit. So this is really a reference to the fourth day of creation. As we talked about, I think we talked about this last time, that we can match up all the days of creation, but each day has a partner. We talked about how the Medrash matches up Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And Shabbos says, what about me? And Hashem says, don't worry, you're going to get the Jewish people as your partner. And then I hope we did this. We looked at the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, who says, the Medrash is great, but it missed out on something. The Vilna Gaon says, no. Day 1, Sunday, is actually connected to Wednesday, day 4. Monday is actually connected to day 5. Is that right? Yeah, Thursday. And Tuesday is connected to Friday. And then he explained to us, like if you can sort of make those columns in your mind, that the first set of days, 1, 4, 5, 1, 5, and 7, 1, 4. Okay, I'm messing up the numbers. Sorry. Yeah. The first 1, 2, and 3 are each brought to their fulfillment by their partner. So in our case here, day 1, where light and dark were created, what happened on day 4? The sun, the moon, and the stars were created. That's what allows the light and the dark to actually reach its potential in the world. So it allows it to access its potency, its power. And so it's interesting that we don't hear anything about the stars here, but we do hear a lot about the sun and the moon. So let's just talk for a moment, because I think it's just fascinating, the lessons that Chazal, that the sages want us to learn from the sun and from the moon. So there are a couple of famous midrashim. One of them is that the way the pasuk starts, it talks about that Hashem created hameorot hagdolim, these very large luminaries. And then we find out that there is a ma'or hagadol and ma'or katan, that there's a bigger one and a smaller one. But the pasuk originally told me that Hashem created 2 big luminaries. So the Medrash explains, well, you know what happens, says the Midrash. What happens was the moon said to Hashem, it can't be that there are 2 kings with 1 crown, right? Obviously, one has to be bigger and stronger than the other. Hashem, you're the perfect example of that, right? And Hashem says, oh, is that how you feel? No problem. You can be the little guy and the sun will be the big guy. It's like parenting at its best. Really? That's how you feel? Okay. So what's fascinating is that Chazal want us to learn this lesson of humility, right? That don't be so sure that you're the one that needs to be in charge. When you raise the idea, Hashem says, actually, now that you mention it, I'm going to give more of the power to the sun. What we see here, of course, also is that the moon becomes only a reflection of the power of the sun, that the moon itself has no light, but it is constantly it's bringing its light to the world from the sun. That's like its energy source. That's where the light comes from. So one, we see that the sages want us to learn humility. Another interesting thing that we see is from a different midrash that I actually saw first here in Tehillim, is that when Hashem looked at nature and all the things he created, he had this, conversation with himself where he said, you know something, I know that eventually people are going to struggle with idol worship. Like it's not going to take so long. It's going to be something that's going to be hard for them. They're going to get confused by things that are powerful in nature and think that they have power unto themselves. And in fact, this is how the Rambam, Maimonides, explains how idol worship became a thing. Is that it started by people having reverence for powerful aspects of nature, right? In particular, the sun seems to be, one of the original parts of nature that people were worshiping. And the Rambam explains one thing led to another, and it became, from aspects of nature to inanimate objects and things like that, but that it all started from inherently a logical place, a rational place, right? This is a powerful thing in nature, and it's an agent of Hashem himself. It's just an intermediary. It's a way for me to relate to God. I can't see God and I can't hear him, but I certainly can see the sun. And that's just Hashem's way of making his presence felt in this world. So that's an interesting approach. So Hashem said, okay, well, since they're likely to fail and fall in this way, they're more likely to fall and fail if I give them only one luminary, right? If all the power is with the sun, then they're for sure going to have trouble. But if I like split it up a little bit between the sun and the moon, maybe then they'll see there's not one force in nature that is totally in control. Even the sun, that is so powerful and so strong, has to share its light with the moon. Again, one of the ways that Chazal, that the sages are trying to teach us, like every human, every person, every aspect of creation requires a partner. You can't do things all by yourself all the time. This is a tough lesson for a lot of us to learn, who would just rather do it by myself, right? Which is what we're familiar with, like toddlers saying that they want to do it by themselves. But the bottom line is most of us still have that same approach of, it's just easier if I do it by myself. And Chazal, and it seems Hashem himself, are just constantly giving us this message, but you're not meant to do things by yourself. Lo tov heyot adam levado. A person's not meant to be by themselves in everything that they do. Even though it might be more complicated and it might be more difficult, you're better off doing things, having a partner in your endeavors. Look, even the sun needs the moon. And this, I think, is just an interesting also approach that the Midrash also gives credit to the sun. This is fascinating. Why are you giving credit to the sun? Does the sun have a choice about whether it shares its light with the moon or not? Of course not, right? All this ideas about the moon talking to God and the sun talking to God and having humility and being boastful and all of that. No, we know that that's just the sage's way of teaching us lessons. Neither the sun nor the moon have a personality, but they are reflections of our own characteristics. And so the sages give the sun credit for making room for the moon. Like the sun is all powerful, but look what it does. Even though it has the upper hand, it chooses to share the spotlight, so to speak, with the moon. And it's fascinating because even though you and I know it's not a choice, we still give the sun credit for doing it. Because let's assume the sun does it graciously. Sometimes we feel like we don't need to give credit to people because they had no choice. They were doing it anyway, or they had to do it. But that's not what Chazal are teaching us. What the sages are teaching us is even when somebody had to do something, they were obligated, or their hands were tied behind their back and the thing was going to happen anyway, we can still give the individual credit for sharing the spotlight, even though it wasn't necessarily their choice. We could still give them credit. So those are just a couple of ideas around the moon and about the sun, learning humility. And humility, of course, is the necessary component in being in any type of partnership, any type of relationship. And that seems to be one of the messages that we are getting from these particular psukim about the sun and the moon, right? Is this ability to be able to work together. As we say, right? Oseh shalom bimromav. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu. What does it mean that Hashem makes peace bimromav up there in the heavens? It might be referring to this. He's figured out a way, because he's Hashem, so nothing requires too much figuring out, how to manage all of these powerful things. There's fire up there, and there seems to be, according to what we know from Breshit, there's water up there. There's all these opposing forces. And he gets it all to work out. He can make peace up there. He can make peace down here. And of course, we take this very much as a directive to ourselves also, right? That we need to make peace down here. If Hashem can manage to make peace up there, we need to be making peace down here. Halavai. Okay. One last thing about the moon we'll just mention is that the moon is very much related to the Jewish people. It's related to human beings in general, in particular related to women. The whole notion of a monthly cycle, which is clearly based on the moon, the waxing and the waning, as we've talked about before, that is very much related to women, but also to the Jewish people as a whole. When we say Kiddush Levana, when we say the prayer that sanctifies the new moon, so that's one of the things we talk about, right, is how the Jewish people have our good days and our not as good days, days where we feel more easily connected, days where we feel less connected, stronger, weaker. It's dynamic, as we said, there's constant change. And we also see very much that the Jewish people and the moon have a kind of a partnership going. We don't have a calendar without the moon. We don't know when our Jewish holidays are without the moon. And the moon can't fulfill its purpose without the Jewish people, right? The moon is there to guide us on the calendar, and we're there to be Makadesh the moon, that we have this sort of very nice partnership at play that allows us to help each other out. Hakfirim shoagim lataref ulevakesh me'el achlam. So, no, I skipped the pasuk again. Sorry about that. Pasuk chaf. Tashet choshech vihi laila. You know what happens? Hashem brings darkness into the world, and then it's nighttime. Botirmos kol chai toyar. And you know what happens when it gets dark out? That's when all the beasts of the forest, that's where the wild things are. If you remember that book, right? They all come out at night. And again, another reference to the fact that each part of nature has what's needed. Like you and I might say, it's so annoying in the winter when the sun sets so early and there are so few hours of daylight. But what David HaMelech is telling us is, I know, but you know what happens when the sun goes down? That's when the animals can come out, and they need their time at night. Just like we need our time during the day, they need their time at night. And so the world is never just sitting dull, right? It's not useless time. It's not time that's not purposeful or meaningful. I mean, today, obviously, we can make it daytime for a lot longer than they used to be able to. But the idea that there is a time where human beings can roam the earth, and there's a time when the animals can feel free and they can roam the earth. And we're going to see this again in the next few psukim. Hakfirim shoagim lataref. The lions are roaring, not necessarily for prey, says the Ibn Ezra, but they're roaring when they have prey. And also at times when they are hungry or when they are connecting to Hashem and seeking his help in helping them find prey, like almost like they, we say bracha, we already have food in front of us, but in the animal kingdom, in the wild, the food is like not there. They have to go find it. And so there's this idea of the animals reaching out, calling out to Hashem and asking for help to find food, which is a beautiful image. And then Tizrach Hashemesh Ye'asefun. When the sun starts rising, all of the animals go back into hiding. They go back home. Ve'el me'onatam yirbatzun. They go back into their dens, back into their ma'on. Ma'on is like a safe place. They go back into they're yirbatzun. They're couching. So it's interesting is some of the Mefarshim say they're resting, they're hibernating, they're catching up on, their sleep. But other Mefarshim look at this and say, nah, that's not what yirbatzun means, right? Rovates, which is a word we're familiar with from Cain, who killed his brother Havel. And when he speaks to Hashem, and Hashem responds back to him, Hashem says, la petach chatat rovates. That word rovates. And what it means is sin is crouching at your door. Like once a person has engaged in a very, in this case, a violent act or has violated something in a very significant way. So the image we have is that sin is crouching at the door. It's always ready to pounce as soon as the person walks through that passageway, that the sin is just right there. So sort of gives us this imagery of what's happening when the animal might look like it's resting, but it's really just gathering its energy that it needs to pounce the next day. So they're couching in their dens, not just this image of like sleeping soundly and peacefully, but they're like gathering their energy, right? If only that's how we all slept, right? We slept with like, as soon as we see the sunrise, we're like popping up, but we have all this energy to yirbatzun, to be able to jump and to crouch in our dens. And then, of course, what happens when the animals gather into their hiding places, into their resting places? Yetzei adam lefoalo. That's when man goes out to work. That's when man goes out and does his business, what he needs to be doing in the world. V'la avodato adei arav. And we work until nighttime, right? Until the evening. This is a great advertisement for our work-life balance. From sunrise to sunset, that's when we work. And otherwise, we don't work. So you see this beautiful partnership between the animal kingdom and humanity, that we have our time where we're in charge and they have their time when we're in charge. We have a time when we can rest. They have a time when they can rest. Something that I think is really very much lacking today, that we don't have this sense of like going, and then stopping. We just are going at different paces throughout the day and the night. And this system seems like it's really set up for, this is your job during this time of the 24-hour, period. And this is your job during the rest. Your job is to work and be productive and work the land and, make a difference. And then there's downtime. Then there's time to rest, just like the animal kingdom. And then we'll end with this pasuk. This is a great place to stop. Ma rabu ma'asacha Hashem Kulam b'chachma asita, right? Wow, how wondrous, how amazing, how many things, Hashem, have you made, and you made them all with tremendous wisdom. Malah haaretz kinyanecha. The earth is full of your creations. Now, this pasuk could easily be said to be like the theme, the most significant pasuk in all of the parak. And in fact, when you get to this, you're kind of thinking you're done. This pretty much sums up the message David has been trying to give us. We're going to see that he has another 10 or 11 psukim after this that we'll study together next week, hopefully. But this is the pinnacle of the parak. This is the highlight at this point where David is just completely and totally in awe. He is just, what? Wow. Marabu ma'asacha. How many details, how much complexity are in all of your creations, Hashem. And they were all done with chachma. They were all done with wisdom. The concept of chachma is an interesting idea. We always translate it to be wisdom, but the idea of chachma is, I think, best understood with the following idea. When it comes to character traits, the idea of chachma is that a person knows when and how to use which personality trait that they have, right? So wisdom is not just an accumulation of knowledge. Wisdom, chachma, according to the Torah, is the idea that we all have different personality traits. We all have different characteristics. But what makes a person wise, what makes a person, get a little sample of Hashem's wisdom is knowing when to use which character trait. So this goes along with the idea that there's no such thing as a bad character trait, with the exception of anger, according to Maimonides. But every other character trait, there is a time and a place for it. There is a time to be generous, and there is a time where it's appropriate to be stingy. There is a time when a person should be patient, but you're not always supposed to be patient. Sometimes you're supposed to be more proactive and you're supposed to take action, right? And you can literally go through any personality trait. There is a time for laziness. There's a time for all the things that we tend to think are so bad, but they're not always bad. And what the Chachma is telling us, or what Chachma demands of us, is figuring out when we should use which personality trait. When am I silent and when do I say something, right? When do I contribute and when do I just sit back and let things unfold as they're meant to unfold? And so the idea of Marabu Masacha Hashem, oh my gosh, Hashem, everything you made, all the things, I'll never even understand all the things, but you did all of them with Chachma. And that's something we want to model ourselves after, is this idea that there's a time and a place for everything. There's a use for everything, as we've mentioned, that every tree, that even though David HaMelech was wondering, well, what do we need this tree for? I can't even build the temple. Now I know, because that bird only builds its nest in that particular tree, right? Why do we need this part of nature? Or why do we need this human being who seems to really be just causing all sorts of problems, right? That's because Kulam b'chachma asita. Hashem knows what he's doing. There is a wisdom, there is a plan behind everything. Malah haaretz kinyanecha. The world is full of things that are kinyanim. A kinyan is an acquisition. So everything is full, the world, I should say, is full of Hashem's possessions, Hashem's acquisitions. And this, of course, could be read as instructions for all of us, that this is how we're supposed to view ourselves, right? We are Hashem's property. And nature is Hashem's property. And as much as we know that human beings are at the highest level of creation, but the great equalizer is the fact that Hashem created me in the same way that he created every other living, breathing thing that's on this earth. And so with that in mind, it is definitely a call to protect the other kinyanim, because after all, we're all creatures of God. It is definitely a call to protect all humans, because obviously we're all kinyanim. We are all of Hashem's possessions, his acquisitions. And the other thing I would suggest is that when we realize that we're struggling or having trouble with another one of Hashem's precious acquisitions, another human being, perhaps, an organization, a group of people, whatever it might be, is to keep this idea in mind, right? We are all are we all doing what we're supposed to be doing? My job is to be a kinyan of Hashem. My job is to keep Hashem as my master, as my boss. And when I do that, so sometimes it allows me to have a different perspective on some of the difficult interactions that I might be having. So marabu masacha, right? This is a beautiful way to end as the snow has started falling. It's so huge snowflakes. Oh my goodness. And it is beautiful. But to take a look at nature and to make this one of our themes, right? One of our lines that we say to ourselves as we look around and we are able to appreciate different aspects of nature. Marabu Masach Hashem. But again, this is not limited to nature itself. It includes us. It includes human beings, that we were also made with Chachma. And finally, I'll just add that it is through appreciation of Hashem's wisdom, right, that we come to appreciate him, that we get a little closer to understanding him, a little closer to what it means to have proper respect and awe for our creator, because it's really not something any of us will ever get down 100%. But the more we appreciate and enjoy nature, and for those of us who are not so outdoorsy, this is really a push to get ourselves outdoors and to appreciate the outdoors and all the beautiful world that Hashem has created for us, that it is really, it's one of the ways that Hashem allows us to connect him and to appreciate him is through nature, is through his creations. And that is, I think, a great place to end for the day today. And God willing, next week, we'll pick up and we will finish Kuf Daled 104. So thank you all for being here today and for learning with me. I wish you all a warm, safe, healthy day. God willing, we should hear Bisarot Tovot, good news. Next week, we'll finish this, but I have a couple of things that are a little connected to Purim, so we'll try to tie that in as well. Okay, have a great week, everybody.
Thank you, Rifki.
Thank you. Oh, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to see you.
You know what I do? Every time I take off in the plane, and the plane take off, I say, Marabu Ma'asech Hashem.
Absolutely.
All the time.
It's beautiful. Oh, that's amazing. Amazing.
But
You get the bird's eye view. Absolutely.